In a ballroom filled with wealth, beauty, and flawless lies, it was a child's whisper that cut through the noise. One quiet voice noticed the truth no millionaire wanted to see. The chandeliers in the ballroom glowed with a soft, golden light, casting warmth across marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. And the sound of laughter mixed with the clink of champagne glasses as some of the most powerful people in the city gathered for the charity gala. Adrian Vale stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding attention without effort. The kind of man people turned to watch when he entered a room. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his hair cut with precision, his eyes sharp with the calculation of a man used to studying balance sheets and competitors. By his side, Celeste dazzled. She was stunning in a pale silk gown that caught the light with every movement, her smile radiant and practiced. The kind of smile that could make even the most skeptical guest lean in a little closer. In her arms, she held an infant wrapped in a soft white blanket, presenting the child like a precious jewel. She spoke of the baby with a voice filled with affection, telling anyone who asked that the little girl belonged to her cousin who had fallen on difficult times. The guests melted at the story, charmed by the picture of beauty, grace, and selfless devotion. Adrian, ever the rational man, had accepted her words as fact. He admired her poise, the way she seemed to embody both elegance and warmth, the perfect partner to stand beside him in his empire. But while the adults smiled and nodded, Emma watched. The 8-year-old girl stood a step behind Adrian, small and quiet, in a pale blue dress Josephine had chosen for her, her brown eyes wide as she studied every detail of the scene before her. She had been with Adrian only a short while, placed in his care through circumstances neither had fully chosen, and though she spoke little, she noticed much. Years of moving from one foster home to another had taught her to see what others ignored, because noticing had always been the difference between safety and danger. She tugged gently at Adrian's sleeve, her fingers so small against the dark fabric of his jacket that he barely felt them at first. He continued speaking with a business associate, nodding politely, though his mind was half on the baby Celeste carried, half on the deal waiting for him the next morning. The tug came again, more insistent, and at last he glanced down at the little girl beside him. She leaned close, her voice no more than a breath against the noise of the gala. "That baby isn't theirs," she whispered. The words landed like ice in his chest. He froze, his polished mask faltering for the briefest second. He turned his head slightly, searching her small face for some trace of mischief, but Emma's expression was serious, almost solemn, her eyes fixed on Celeste and the child in her arms. Adrian straightened, suddenly deaf to the laughter and music around him. He looked at Celeste, radiant as ever, the picture of generosity and love, and yet the seed of doubt was planted. Emma tugged at his sleeve once more, but this time she didn't speak. She only pointed, a tiny finger aimed at the baby wrapped in silk and secrets, and Adrian felt his certainty slip just enough to let suspicion take hold. The drive back from the gala was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed between the seats and filled every corner of the car. Adrian Vale sat behind the wheel, his hands steady on the leather steering wheel, his expression calm to anyone who might have glanced his way, but inside his thoughts were heavy and restless. He could not shake the words Emma had whispered, so soft that no one else had heard, yet strong enough to echo in his mind even now. That baby isn't theirs. It was such a simple statement, almost childish, and yet it carried a weight he couldn't dismiss. Beside him in the back seat, Emma leaned her head against the glass window, her small figure half hidden in the folds of her coat. She was only 8 years old, a foster child who had come into his life, not because he had been seeking a daughter, but because the court had asked him, a man of means, with a large house and the resources to provide stability, to take her in temporarily. He had agreed with little thought, assuming it would be an arrangement of months, not realizing that the quiet girl would notice everything about his life in ways no one else ever had. Emma did not chatter like other children. She did not ask endless questions or beg for toys or treats. Instead, she watched. She watched when the staff moved through the house. She watched when Celeste laughed a little too loud at one of his jokes. She watched the way the baby at the gala stiffened in her fiancé's arms instead of melting into her embrace. And when she finally spoke, her words were sharp, precise, and frighteningly true. Adrian's mind replayed her small face as she leaned close in that crowded ballroom. Her eyes locked not on him, but on Celeste, as if daring him to see what she saw. He remembered the way she tugged on his sleeve, steady and insistent, like she knew if she didn't make him listen, no one else ever would. He had spent years building a business on facts and logic, on data and analysis, yet in that moment a whisper from an 8-year-old had unsettled him more than 1,000 pages of market reports ever could. When they reached the house, Josephine was waiting in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her posture steady as always. She greeted them warmly, taking Emma's coat and asking if she was tired. Emma only shrugged, her eyes darting once more to Adrian before she padded upstairs to her room. He watched her go, feeling the unease settle deeper. Later, when the house was quiet, Adrian stood by his office window, the city lights flickering like restless stars in the distance. He thought about Emma's history, the reports he had read when she came to him, the notes about her tendency to observe, to remain silent, to adapt quickly to new homes, by learning the unspoken rules faster than anyone expected. She had survived by paying attention, by reading people's faces and movements, by trusting her instincts when adults failed her. Now she was in his home, under his protection, and she was telling him something he did not want to believe. Yet deep down he knew she had seen something he had missed, and the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Celeste moved through the room as though she had been born for it, her pale gown catching the light, her hair perfectly styled so that every turn of her head seemed deliberate. People leaned closer when she spoke, eager for a smile, a glance, a moment of her attention, and she gave it all with practiced ease. In her arms, the baby lay wrapped in a soft blanket, tiny fingers curling and uncurling, dark lashes brushing against round cheeks. Celeste held the child like a treasured possession, swaying slightly as if the rhythm alone proved her tenderness. She told the story again and again, never losing her composure, never faltering as she painted the picture of a family tragedy softened by her generosity. Her cousin, she said, had struggled terribly, left alone without support, unable to raise a child in such cruel circumstances. Celeste had stepped in out of love, out of duty, because family meant everything to her. The guests sighed and nodded, moved by her selflessness, charmed by her quiet strength, touched by the beauty of a woman who could combine elegance with compassion. Even the sharpest critics seemed to melt in her presence. Adrian watched her from across the ballroom, admiring not just her beauty, but the way she commanded attention without appearing to demand it. She seemed to belong in every room she entered, a woman who could ease his path in both business and society. With her beside him, people smiled wider, doors opened faster, deals seemed to fall into place. Yet as much as he admired her, he felt the whisper from earlier pressing against his thoughts like a shadow he could not dismiss. That baby isn't theirs. Emma stood nearby, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the evening. She didn't shift uncomfortably under the chandeliers, didn't fidget the way most children would when surrounded by strangers. Instead, she watched. Her brown eyes followed every movement Celeste made, every smile, every tilt of her head, but her gaze lingered longer on the baby. She studied the way the infant turned its face away from Celeste's touch, the stiff little flinch when she adjusted the blanket, the faint whimper that came without tears. Emma's lips pressed together as though she were holding back words, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. When Celeste told the story once more to a cluster of well-dressed guests, Adding a new detail about the cousin's failing health, Emma let out a soft sound, almost too quiet to hear. Her eyes narrowed, and as the guests praised Celeste's kindness, she whispered to herself, just loud enough that Adrian caught the edge of it, "She's lying." The words were not shouted, they carried no drama, yet they rang in Adrian's mind sharper than the applause that followed Celeste's tale. He looked at Emma, at the serious set of her face, at the way her small shoulders straightened as if bracing against the disbelief she expected from everyone around her. No one else noticed, no one else cared. The adults were too caught up in Celeste's charm, but Emma's quiet certainty unsettled him. He told himself she was only a child, that children sometimes misunderstood what they saw, but when he turned his eyes back to Celeste, he found himself searching for cracks in the perfection she wore so easily, and for the first time, he wondered what was hidden beneath the glow of her practiced smile. The house was quiet after the gala, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock filling the silence as Adrian loosened his tie and walked through the dimly lit halls. He should have been thinking about the speeches he had given, the business partners he had greeted, the donations pledged for the evening's cause, but his mind kept circling back to Emma. Her whisper had clung to him all night, refusing to let go, and when he looked at her now, seated cross-legged on the sofa with her small hands folded neatly in her lap, he saw a seriousness that unsettled him more than any corporate negotiation ever could. He sat down across from her, lowering himself into the leather chair, careful not to let his expression harden. She was just a child, he reminded himself, a foster girl, still learning what safety meant, yet her words had cut through the glamour of the evening with unnerving precision. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Emma, why did you say that about the baby tonight?" She lifted her head slowly, her brown eyes steady, not frightened, not mischievous, just clear. "Because it isn't theirs," she said simply, as though repeating a fact she had memorized. He almost smiled at the firmness in her tone, but the weight of her words kept the smile from forming. "Emma," he began carefully. "Celeste explained that the baby belongs to her cousin, that she's only caring for it until things settle." Everyone seemed to believe her. "Why didn't you?" Emma's fingers twisted the hem of her dress as she thought, her small voice calm when she answered. "The baby doesn't like her. Babies know their mothers. Even when they're small, they move toward them. Their faces change. Their eyes follow them. That baby turns away every time Celeste touches her." She paused, tilting her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And they don't look the same. Celeste has green eyes, and the babies are dark, almost black. Their faces don't match, not even a little." Adrian felt a flicker of unease as he listened. He wanted to dismiss it as childish imagination, but her observations carried a sharpness that was difficult to ignore. "Maybe the baby is just shy," he suggested, his voice measured. "Or maybe it's tired. That would explain the crying." Emma shook her head, her hair brushing against her cheeks. "No," she cries differently with Celeste. "It's not the hungry cry or the tired cry. It's the scared cry. I heard it." She holds her stiff, like she doesn't want to be there. Her words, though soft, carried a certainty that made Adrian sit back in his chair. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, torn between reason and instinct. He had spent his life relying on logic, on proof, on data. Yet here was a child who had no evidence beyond what she saw and heard. And still she spoke with the conviction of someone who had learned to trust her own senses. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was too young to understand. But another part of him remembered how she had watched quietly all evening, missing nothing. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, the image of Celeste's dazzling smile colliding with Emma's whisper. Logic told him to dismiss it, but the innocence of Emma's instincts tugged at him with a force he couldn't explain. When he opened his eyes again, she was still watching him, patient and certain, as though waiting for him to decide whether he would believe what everyone else ignored. The morning after the gala, Adrian found himself standing in his study, with the guardianship papers spread across his desk. Celeste had shown them to him before, casual and confident, assuring him that everything was in order. Yet now, as he looked at them under the clear light of day, he saw details he had not bothered to question. The signatures were perfectly aligned, the stamps too crisp, the ink too new for documents that were supposed to have been filed months earlier. Even the language in the forms felt rehearsed, almost like a script designed to convince rather than record. He frowned, tracing one line with his finger, wondering why he had not noticed before, and why Emma's whisper made every word look suspicious now. Celeste entered the room without knocking, her perfume arriving a second before she did, sweet and sharp, filling the air around him. She carried the baby in her arms, humming softly, as though nothing in the world could disturb her peace. When she saw the papers on the desk, she smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone hiding something, but the confident curve of lips that had charmed countless people before. "Still worrying over these?" she teased gently, leaning down to brush a kiss across his cheek. "Darling, I told you, everything is official. You of all people should know how important it is to have things done properly." Adrian wanted to believe her. He wanted to accept the warmth in her voice, the way she pressed her body lightly against his, the way she made him feel like doubting her was the same as doubting love itself. But when he glanced at the baby, swaddled in satin, he noticed again what Emma had said. The child was stiff, her small face turned away from Celeste's chest, her tiny fists clenched, as though bracing against contact. "Something about the paperwork doesn't sit right," Adrian said finally, his voice calm, almost too calm. "The dates don't line up. And I thought your cousin lived out of state, yet these forms are filed locally." Celeste's laugh was light, practiced, almost musical. "Oh, Adrian, you're letting business make you suspicious of everything. My cousin wanted it handled here, where I could keep an eye on things. Lawyers suggested it would be easier. Honestly, do you think I could invent all this?" She lifted the papers, tapping them with manicured nails, her eyes warm and shining. He looked at her, trying to read the truth in her face, but all he saw was perfection. She leaned close, her lips brushing his jaw, her words a whisper meant to soothe. "Trust me, we're building a life together, aren't we? Don't let little things ruin it." Her charm worked as it always did, wrapping around his doubt like silk, softening edges that should have cut deep. Yet when she left the study, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, Adrian remained at his desk, staring at the two perfect papers. For the first time since he had met her, trust felt like something fragile, and the first fracture had already appeared. The house was calm in the late afternoon, sunlight streaming through tall windows and falling across polished floors that Josephine had kept spotless for more than 20 years. She moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who knew every corner, every sound, every habit of the family she had served. First for Adrian's parents, and now for Adrian himself. She had seen him grow from a restless boy into the man who now commanded entire boardrooms, and though she never intruded, she always noticed. That was her gift. Watching quietly, waiting, and remembering. Emma had taken to shadowing her when she wasn't tucked away in her room with her books or slipping into corners to observe the adults. The little girl walked beside Josephine as she dusted shelves or folded linen, asking few questions, her silence more like a steady hum than an absence. Josephine didn't mind. She understood silence, and she understood children who trusted only with their eyes. That day, while Celeste napped upstairs with the baby resting in her arms, Emma leaned against the kitchen counter and watched Josephine chop herbs with slow, deliberate movements. At last she spoke, her voice barely above the sound of the knife against the board. "You see it too, don't you?" Josephine paused, her hands stilling, though her expression did not change. "See what, child?" "The baby doesn't belong to her," Emma said simply, her brown eyes steady. "Everyone else believes her story, but I can tell you don't." Josephine set the knife down and studied the girl. In Emma's gaze, she saw a seriousness far older than her years. The kind of knowing born from too many places where children had to survive by reading adults. She exhaled slowly. "You're right," she said at last. "Something is off. I have known many mothers in my time, and I know how babies are with them. This one is different. Too quiet sometimes, too restless other times. And Miss Celeste, well, she holds the child as though she is performing, not caring. It's men and the wanting to them." Emma's shoulders relaxed, as if hearing those words lifted a weight she had carried alone. She stepped closer, her voice still low. "Adrian doesn't want to believe me. He thinks I'm just imagining things. But I know what I saw." Josephine reached out and placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, her touch firm and reassuring. "Then we watch together," she said. "We do not accuse without proof, but we keep our eyes open. Secrets cannot stay hidden forever, not in this house." From that day on, Emma and Josephine formed a quiet alliance. They noticed the way Celeste always rehearsed her story before repeating it, how she turned conversations towards sympathy whenever anyone asked about the child, how her smile stiffened when the baby cried in her arms. They noted the times she slipped away with her phone, speaking in hurried whispers, and how the baby relaxed only when placed in the crib or held by someone else. Adrian remained caught between reason and doubt, but Josephine and Emma said nothing to him yet. They waited, gathering small details like threads, trusting that in time they would weave together into a truth no one could ignore. And in that silence, the bond between the old caretaker and the child who watched grew strong. Two observers seeing what others refused to see, preparing for the moment when the performance would collapse. The week after the gala, Adrian returned to the rhythm of meetings and contracts, yet the whisper in his mind refused to quiet. Celeste continued to move through the house, with the grace of someone who belonged everywhere she set foot, her laughter spilling into rooms as though she had no care in the world. But Adrian had begun to see edges he had never noticed before. It was in the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, in the way her arms stiffened when the baby grew restless, in the way her story never changed but always sounded too polished, too neat. And then there was Miles. Miles Wren had been his friend for more than a decade, the man who had stood by him when his company was nothing more than an idea sketched across napkins in late-night diners. He had been loyal, efficient, sharp, and for years, Adrian had trusted him without question. But lately, Miles seemed different. He dropped by the house more often than usual, claiming he needed Adrian's signature or wanted to discuss strategy. Yet his visits never ended quickly. He lingered in the living room, his eyes always straying toward Celeste and the child in her arms. Adrian noticed it during one of those visits, a subtle shift in Miles's expression when Celeste entered with the baby. His gaze softened for a moment, not with affection but with something harder to read, something calculating. When Adrian teased him lightly about his sudden interest in domestic scenes, Miles only laughed and said, "She's good for you, Adrian. Celeste is exactly the kind of woman you need at your side." He spoke with such certainty that Adrian felt his suspicion sharpen. Later that evening, Emma tugged at his sleeve as he worked in his study. Her voice was low, careful, the way it always was when she spoke of things she knew others might dismiss. "He talks to her when you're not there," she whispered. Adrian looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowing. "Who talks to who?" "Miles and Celeste," she said, her eyes steady. "I saw them in the hallway yesterday. They were close, whispering." She laughed, but it wasn't her real laugh, and when they noticed me, they stopped right away. The words unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Emma had been right before, noticing things he had brushed aside, and he found himself leaning back in his chair, her whisper pressing into the unease already forming inside him. He wanted to believe in Miles, just as he wanted to believe in Celeste, but the certainty with which they both insisted on trust now felt too heavy, too rehearsed, as though spoken to cover a crack that was beginning to show. That night, as Adrian stood by the tall windows of his bedroom, He thought of Miles's hand resting a moment too long on Celeste's arm, of the way her eyes flickered with recognition when she caught his glance, of the whisper Emma had shared in her calm, unwavering voice. The baby slept quietly in the next room, and yet the house no longer felt safe. Suspicion had crept into its walls, and Adrian knew it would not leave easily. The rain fell steadily against the tall windows, turning the house into a place of soft echoes and muffled sounds. Celeste had gone out for the afternoon, claiming she needed to meet a friend for coffee, and Josephine was busy in the kitchen preparing supper. Adrian was upstairs on a conference call, his voice firm behind the closed door of his study. The silence left behind was the kind Emma liked best, the kind where no one asked her questions, no one told her what to do, and she could slip unnoticed into places where answers waited. She had been watching Celeste carefully for days, noticing how she often slipped into the smaller study near the library, the room no one else ever entered. Celeste would lock the door for an hour or two and emerge with the baby in her arms, her expression perfectly calm, yet her perfume sharp in the air as though covering a faster heartbeat. Emma's curiosity had been growing, and this afternoon the moment finally arrived. She padded down the hallway, her shoes silent against the carpet, and pressed her ear to the door of the study. Nothing. Celeste was gone. Emma reached into the pocket of her cardigan, where she kept a thin piece of wire Josephine had once used to fix a drawer. She had taught herself to use it on the foster homes that kept their pantries locked. It was easy enough now, her small fingers nimble, the soft click of the lock releasing like a sigh. Inside, the room smelled faintly of roses and ink. Papers lay in neat stacks on the desk, too neat, as if arranged for someone who expected to be checked. Emma moved carefully, her eyes scanning the polished wood until they landed on a folder tucked beneath a glossy magazine. She pulled it free and opened it. Her breath caught. Inside were adoption papers, but they looked wrong. The names were typed in sharp black letters, the signatures smooth and perfect, like something written by a machine instead of a hand. She had seen real forms before, in case files and social worker visits, and these were too clean, too polished, without the smudges and creases of documents handled through real courts. She flipped through page after page, her chest tightening. At the bottom was Celeste's name, her handwriting too flawless, every letter identical to the last. Emma closed the folder quickly, her heart pounding, and slipped it into her backpack, burying it beneath her notebook and pencils. She locked the study door behind her and hurried down the hall, her small figure vanishing just as Josephine called her to the kitchen. That evening, when the house grew quiet again, she found Adrian in his office, his tie loosened, his eyes weary from hours of business. She stood before him, her backpack clutched against her chest. "I found something," she whispered, pulling out the folder and setting it on his desk. Adrian opened it slowly, his jaw tightening as he read. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was nothing, but the weight in his chest told him Emma was right. The papers were forged, and if that was true, it meant his life was tangled in something far darker than he wanted to admit. The evening felt heavy in a way Adrian could not name. The air inside the house seemed thick, the glow of the chandeliers too bright, the silence between words sharper than usual. Celeste noticed it before he said a single thing. She was quick that way, always reading him, always turning the smallest shift in his expression into something she could bend to her advantage. She set down her glass of wine, her eyes already shimmering with unshed tears, and asked softly why he had been so quiet all day. Adrian tried to keep his tone steady, tried to speak of work and deadlines, but she leaned forward and touched his arm, her voice breaking just enough to make the moment seem intimate. "It's not business, is it? It's me." The words hung between them, not a question, but a declaration. He did not answer right away, and his pause alone gave her fuel. Her eyes filled, the tears spilling over as though she had been holding them back for hours. "You don't trust me anymore," she whispered, her voice low and wounded. He wanted to deny it, to reach for her and smooth away the tremble in her lips, but the folder Emma had placed on his desk the night before sat heavy in his memory. Forged documents. Perfect signatures, too. Clean lines. His chest tightened with the weight of it. Celeste leaned back then, anger flashing beneath the fragile surface of her tears. After everything I've done for you? After everything I've given? You think I would lie? You think I would use you? Her words came faster, her voice rising and falling like a practiced melody. She reminded him of the nights she had comforted him after long meetings, the times she had stood proudly at his side during press interviews, the way she had opened her heart and her life to him without hesitation. Every sentence pressed against him like a wall he did not know how to climb. Adrian rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands tightening behind his back. He could feel her eyes on him, burning with accusation and hurt. He wanted proof beyond what Emma had given him, something undeniable, yet the child's quiet certainty would not leave his thoughts. He saw again her small face, her steady voice saying, "She's lying." And then he remembered the way the baby had stiffened in Celeste's arms, the way her story had sounded too polished, the way Miles had looked at her with something unspoken in his eyes. Celeste came to him then, her steps soft, her hands reaching for his shoulders. "Darling, don't let them put ideas in your head. People envy what we have. They want to break us apart. But we are stronger than that, aren't we?" Her lips brushed his cheek, warm and familiar, her perfume wrapping around him like a net. For a moment, he almost gave in, almost let the comfort of her charm erase the doubts clawing at him. But when he looked at her, he saw the glimmer of calculation hiding behind her tears, and his heart wavered. He said nothing, torn between the child who spoke only truth and the woman who made lies sound like love. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls of the house and made every sound sharper. Adrian sat in his study with the lights dimmed, staring at the papers spread across his desk without really reading them. His mind was caught between two voices, Celeste with her polished charm, her tears and her convincing warmth, and Emma with her small, steady voice that never wavered when she said the baby did not belong. He had built an empire on facts and evidence, yet here he was, unable to choose between a child's whisper and a woman's performance. When Josephine knocked softly on the door to bring him tea, he realized he hadn't seen Emma since dinner. He asked if she was in her room, but Josephine frowned, her voice careful. "Her bed is empty, Mr. Adrian." The words made him stand so quickly his chair scraped the floor. Panic flashed through him, sudden and fierce, because Emma was not the kind of child to wander without reason. He called her name down the hall, checked the rooms, searched the staircase, but the house gave no answer. Josephine's face grew tight with worry, and together they moved quickly through the corridors until Josephine whispered, "The garden. It's quite tedious." They stepped outside into the cool night air. The garden spread out under the glow of lanterns. At first, Adrian saw nothing. Then his eyes caught a small figure curled near the rose bushes. Emma sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her thin dress wrinkled and damp from the grass. She did not look up until he knelt in front of her, his voice low but urgent. "Emma, why are you out here?" Tears streaked her face, but her eyes were steady, filled with a sorrow too large for a child. "Because you don't believe me," she said softly. "I showed you the papers. I told you what I saw. But you keep looking at her like she can't be lying." Adrian felt the words pierce him, because they were true. His silence had betrayed his doubt. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back, hugging herself tighter. "If you don't believe me, then the baby will disappear, and we'll never see her again. That's what happens when adults look the other way. Bad people take things, and they don't give them back." Josephine's eyes glistened as she stood a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly. Adrian tried again, his voice breaking. "Emma, I'm listening. I do believe you. I don't want it to be true." Emma shook her head, the moonlight catching the damp strands of her hair. "Wanting doesn't change the truth." She looked at him then, her face pale but fierce. and for the first time he understood how much she carried inside her small frame, the years of not being believed, the weight of knowing when others ignored what was right in front of them. Adrian pulled her gently into his arms, and though she resisted at first, she finally let her head rest against his chest. The night was still, but inside him something shifted. He could no longer afford to stand between trust and doubt. Emma was right, and if he hesitated any longer, the cost would be greater than he could bear. The decision came slowly, but once it settled inside Adrian, it felt like steel. He could no longer drift between Celeste's polished words and Emma's quiet certainty. The risk was too great, the stakes far too high. That night, after finding Emma in the garden, he sat her down in the library with Josephine by his side. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the shelves, and he spoke in a voice that carried both authority and something softer. "We are not waiting anymore. If Celeste is lying, then we will prove it. If she is telling the truth, then we will know for certain. But no more guessing." Emma's brown eyes searched his face, looking for hesitation, and when she saw none, her small shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Josephine nodded in quiet approval, her lips pressed into a firm line. "Then we must be careful," she said. "Miss Celeste is clever. If she suspects we are watching, she will change her ways." Adrian leaned forward, lowering his voice, as though the walls themselves might carry their secrets. "We will record her movements, every time she enters a room with the baby, every time she leaves the house. Emma, you said she speaks on the phone when she thinks no one notices. I want you to mark the times. Josephine, can you help me gather the logs of her calls from the landline? I can handle the cell records." The old housekeeper's eyes glimmered behind her glasses. "I can do more than that. I know which drawer she favors, which bag she keeps locked. If there are notes or instructions, I will find them." Emma's voice was softer but steady. "I can track the baby too. She coughs at night sometimes, and Celeste ignores it. If we write it down, we can show the doctor later." Adrian felt both pride and sorrow at her words. Pride in her sharpness and sorrow that a child had learned to carry such burdens. He nodded firmly. "Yes, we keep a record of everything. If Celeste is hiding the truth, her own actions will betray her." Over the next week, their plan unfolded in silence. Tiny cameras, no larger than coins, were placed in the corners of rooms, discreet and hidden behind carved wood and vases. Josephine moved with practiced ease, her years of service making her presence invisible. Emma kept a notebook she hid beneath her pillow, recording times Celeste slipped away, the baby's cries, the moments the child seemed calm only when someone else held her. Adrian handled the technical work, intercepting calls, setting up systems that tracked data without alerting the sender. The house became a stage, each room a place where secrets could no longer hide. Celeste still smiled, still charmed, still carried the baby as if she were a symbol of her own goodness. But the walls were watching now, and every movement left a trace. Adrian watched the footage at night, his jaw tightening as he saw patterns emerge, moments that matched Emma's careful notes. By the end of the week, the doubt was gone. The truth was no longer a whisper, but a growing shadow, and Adrian knew the trap they had set would soon spring shut. The night was heavy with clouds, the moon hidden behind a gray veil that made the garden darker than usual. Adrian had been restless, pacing the length of his study as the hours stretched toward midnight, unable to focus on the contracts laid out on his desk. Every sound in the house seemed sharper, every creak of the wood carrying weight. He had been living with doubt for too long, and though Emma's notebook and Josephine's observations had painted a troubling picture, part of him still wanted to believe that Celeste's smile was genuine. That fragile hope kept him from closing the door completely, though his instincts told him it was already too late. It was Emma who noticed first. She had crept out of her room for a glass of water and paused at the top of the stairs when she heard the faint sound of the front latch turning. Her eyes narrowed in the dark, her small hand gripping the banister as she leaned forward just enough to see. Celeste was at the door, her pale silk robe tied loosely, the baby bundled against her chest in a blanket. She moved quickly, her steps careful and silent, as though she had done this before. Emma's heart thudded in her chest. She hurried down the hall and tapped lightly on Adrian's study door. He opened it, surprised to see her at such an hour, but her expression silenced his questions. She pointed toward the door, her whisper tight. "She's leaving. With the baby." Adrian felt his stomach twist. Without hesitation, he pulled on his coat and followed Emma down the staircase. The front door was ajar, the night air cold against his face as he stepped outside. At the edge of the garden he saw movement. Celeste, slipping through the gate, her figure barely visible beneath the lantern's faint glow. He gestured for Emma to stay back, and moved quietly after her, his steps muffled by the damp earth. Celeste walked quickly down the side street, the baby pressed close against her, not with tenderness but with efficiency, like cargo she needed to deliver. Adrian kept his distance, his breath steady, his heart pounding louder with every step. After several blocks, she turned into a narrow alley where two men waited near a black car. Their conversation was low but clear enough. When Adrian edged closer, his body hidden behind the corner of a brick wall. "Do you have it?" one man asked, his voice sharp. Celeste shifted the baby into the man's arms for only a moment, enough for him to inspect. Her tone was flat, businesslike, stripped of all the warmth she displayed in the house. "She's healthy. No complications. You'll get the rest when I'm done with him." Adrian felt the ground tilt beneath him. The woman he had almost proposed to, the woman who had dazzled his world with beauty and grace, was speaking with the coldness of a broker arranging a transaction. He stared at the baby, small and defenseless, and realized Emma had been right all along. He stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears, careful not to reveal himself too soon. The whisper that had haunted him for weeks was no longer a child's suspicion, but a truth he had seen with his own eye. And now there was no going back. The next evening, the house no longer felt like a home but a stage waiting for confrontation. Adrian sat in the library with the folder of forged papers spread before him, Emma's careful notes in a neat pile at his side, and the memory of Celeste in that alley replaying in his mind like a wound that refused to close. He had spent the day in silence, waiting for the right moment, weighing every word he would speak. When Celeste entered, her smile bright as ever, carrying the baby as if nothing in the world were wrong, the illusion shattered before she even opened her mouth. He rose slowly, his eyes fixed on her, his voice measured. "Where were you last night?" For the briefest second her mask slipped, but then she laughed lightly and crossed the room to kiss his cheek. "I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. Fresh air always helps." Adrian stepped back, his tone sharper. "With the baby? Meeting strangers in an alley?" The words struck like a blade. Celeste froze, her eyes narrowing, the warmth draining from her face. She set the baby down in the crib by the fireplace, her movements sudden, her hands no longer gentle. When she turned to face him, there was no trace of the woman he had thought he loved. Only a cold edge sharpened by years of calculation. "So you followed me," she said flatly. "I wondered when you would." Emma, hidden just inside the doorway, pressed herself against the wall, her small heart pounding as she listened. Adrian didn't glance at her, but he felt her presence like an anchor. He held up the forged documents, his voice steady. "These papers are false. Every word of your story has been a lie. Who is this child? Why bring her into my house?" Celeste's lips curved, not into a smile but into something bitter. "Because you would never give up anything for yourself. You needed a reason, a family, something to make you open the doors. The baby was leverage. And you, Adrian, you walked right into it." His chest tightened, but he forced himself to ask, "Leverage for what?" She tilted her head, her beauty still intact but her charm gone, replaced by calculation. "Miles knew how to reach you. He said you would do anything for people you claimed as yours. All we had to do was make you believe this child needed you, that I needed you. And then you would sign over the deal, the shares, everything. A new family for you, a fortune for us." The room seemed to close around him. Miles, his oldest friend, his trusted partner, woven into this scheme as easily as Celeste's lies. He wanted to deny it, but her words rang too precise to be invented. "You used an innocent child," he said, his voice low with fury. Celeste shrugged, her eyes cold. "Children are tools, Adrian. You of all people should know everything has a price." The illusion was broken, and nothing about her smile would ever fool him again. Adrian waited until morning to face Miles. He spent the night pacing the library, the fire burning low as he turned over Celeste's words again and again, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had wanted proof, and now he had it, though it felt less like clarity and more like standing on the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath him. When the clock struck 9, Miles arrived as he often did, carrying a folder of reports and wearing the easy smile of a man who believed he was still trusted. They sat in Adrian's office, the air heavy, the silence long before either of them spoke. Adrian studied his friend across the desk, seeing him not as the partner who had stood beside him for 10 years, but as a stranger who had been hiding in plain sight. His voice was calm, but each word landed with weight. "How long have you been lying to me, Miles?" The smile faltered, just slightly, but enough. Miles leaned back in his chair, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about?" Adrian slid the forged adoption papers across the desk, his eyes locked on Miles. "Celeste told me everything. About you. About the plan. About using the baby to push me into a deal I never would have signed." For a moment, Miles held the mask, but then it cracked. His shoulders straightened, his expression hardening into something Adrian had never seen before, cold and sharp. "So she told you. I suppose it was only a matter of time. I should have known you'd put the pieces together." Adrian felt anger flare, but beneath it was grief. The kind that came from realizing loyalty had been nothing more than illusion. "Why, Miles? After everything we built together. Why this?" Miles leaned forward, his voice smooth, almost casual. "Because you've had everything. The company, the fortune, the admiration. You were always the face of it all, the genius, the untouchable one. And me? I was just the man behind the curtain, the name no one remembered. I got tired of it, Adrian. Tired of being in your shadow." Adrian's fists tightened on the arm of his chair. "So you dragged a child into this, a baby, and you thought destroying me would make you what? A leader?" Miles's eyes gleamed with something close to triumph. "Not just destroying you, discrediting you. By the time this was done, the authorities would have found you complicit in child trafficking. The evidence was already prepared. Accounts in your name, messages traced to your devices, the baby in your house. All I had to do was let the story break, and the empire would have collapsed around you. Then I would step in, the man who cleaned up the mess, the savior investors needed. You would be ruined, and I would finally be free." The words chilled Adrian more than angered him. He had known betrayal, but never one crafted with such precision, never one so ruthless. He stood slowly, his voice steady. "You miscalculated. Emma saw more than either of you expected, and Josephine saw through your lies. I know now, Miles, and soon the world will know too." Miles smirked, but the edge of unease flickered in his eyes. "We'll see, old friend." Adrian realized then that friendship had ended long ago, replaced by greed and shadows. What stood before him was no partner at all, only an enemy who had once known his every strength and weakness. The courtroom was colder than Emma expected, its high ceilings and polished wood making her feel smaller than she already was. Adrian sat at the table beside his lawyer, his eyes fixed on her with a steadiness meant to give courage, though she could see the tension in his jaw and the tightness in his shoulders. Josephine was behind them, her presence like a quiet anchor, and together they looked at the 8-year-old girl, who was about to speak words that could change everything. When the judge called her name, Emma walked to the stand with steps careful and deliberate. The clerk asked her to promise to tell the truth, And though her voice was soft, it carried across the room with surprising clarity. She folded her hands in her lap, sitting up straight, and when the lawyer asked her to begin, she did not hesitate. She spoke of the first time she noticed the baby's stiff body in Celeste's arms, the way the child turned her face away instead of leaning close. She explained how Celeste's stories always sounded rehearsed, how every answer came too quickly, as though she had practiced them in front of a mirror. Her small voice did not waver when she described how Miles whispered with Celeste in the hallway, their conversation breaking off the moment they saw her. The lawyer asked what made her believe something was wrong, and Emma's brown eyes filled with tears, though her words remained steady. Because the baby cried different when she held her, she said. It wasn't tired or hungry, it was scared. I know that sound because I used to cry that way too, when people I didn't know tried to make me stay with them. The courtroom grew still at her words. Adults shifting in their seats, realizing that a child who had already endured too much carried the sharpest understanding of fear. She described sneaking into Celeste's study, finding the folder tucked beneath papers that seemed designed to distract. She explained how the signatures were too perfect, how the ink smelled new, how the names didn't match what Celeste had said. She admitted she had hidden the papers in her backpack because she knew no one would believe her otherwise. I thought, if I didn't bring proof, people would just say I was making it up, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. The judge asked her if she understood the seriousness of her words, and Emma nodded. I know, but if I didn't tell, the baby would be gone, and maybe Adrian too, and I couldn't let that happen. When Josephine took the stand after her, she laid out the records she had gathered, financial slips and call logs that matched Emma's observations perfectly. Together, the testimony of a child and the evidence of an old caretaker built a wall no lie could climb. Adrian watched as the case against Celeste and Miles took shape, realizing that the smallest voice in the room had spoken the loudest truth, and that truth was finally undeniable. The morning the authorities arrived, the house was wrapped in silence, the kind that feels unnatural, like the pause before a storm. Adrian stood in his office, the weight of sleepless nights pressing on his shoulders, his eyes on the crib in the corner where the baby stirred restlessly. He had spent weeks walking a thin edge between love and lies, and now the balance was finally tipping. Emma sat nearby, her notebook on her lap, her small hands folded tightly, while Josephine stood at the window, watching the long driveway with eyes sharp as glass. The sound of engines broke the stillness. Black cars pulled up, doors opening in quick rhythm, men and women in dark suits moving with purpose. Adrian felt his chest tighten as they approached the front door. The knock, a heavy blow that echoed through the halls. When he opened it, badges flashed, voices firm but controlled, and in a matter of seconds the house filled with the weight of justice. Celeste descended the staircase, her silk robe flowing behind her, her expression composed as though she believed even this was a performance she could win. She started to smile, to ask what this was about, but her words faltered when the officers read the charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The charm slipped, the mask cracked, and the woman who had once dazzled ballrooms stood exposed. Her hands trembled when they fastened the cuffs around her wrists, yet her eyes darted to Adrian, glittering with venom. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "You think you've won, but you've only made yourself a bigger target." Miles arrived moments later, striding into the house as though he still owned a share of its walls. He stopped cold when he saw the uniforms, his face draining of color as the officers turned toward him. He tried to protest, to insist this was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence Josephine had gathered, Emma's testimony, and the intercepted calls Adrian had traced left no room for denial. His voice cracked as they listed the charges, his old confidence collapsing under the weight of truth. In the corner, the baby began to cry, her small voice cutting through the chaos. An officer moved forward with gentle hands, explaining that a match had been made. She had been listed as missing in another state, her photo on databases, her real parents, still searching, desperately. The news hit Adrian like a blow and a relief all at once. The child had never belonged to Celeste, never belonged to the scheme, but had been stolen and used as leverage in a plan built on greed. As the arrests unfolded, Adrian stood frozen, the reality of what he had nearly lost settling like stone in his chest. His company, his reputation, his freedom, even the fragile bond with Emma, all of it had been inches from destruction. He looked at the little girl who had whispered truth into his ear when no one else dared, and he knew that without her, he would be standing in Celeste's place. The collapse of deception had saved him, but it had also taught him that trust without proof is a dangerous gift, and that sometimes the smallest voice is the one that keeps an empire from crumbling. The weeks that followed passed slowly, each day peeling away the weight of lies that had once filled the house. The silence no longer felt heavy, no longer carried the tension of hidden movements or whispered conspiracies. It was different now, softer, almost warm. Adrian found himself pausing in the hallways just to listen, to hear the sound of Emma's laughter drifting from her room, the scrape of Josephine's chair in the kitchen as she read her morning paper, the ordinary rhythms that had returned after so much deceit. The mansion itself seemed to change. Where once Celeste's carefully chosen paintings had hung, with their polished frames and curated beauty, there were now Emma's drawings. Crayon sketches of gardens and suns and houses with open doors filled the frames, bright colors spilling across the walls that had once seemed too cold. In the sitting room, Josephine had placed old family photographs, her own included, and for the first time Adrian realized how empty those walls had been when only appearances mattered. Now they reflected something else, truth, and the life they were slowly building together. The baby had been reunited with her real parents, a young couple who had searched desperately for months, their joy overwhelming when the truth was revealed. Adrian had stood quietly aside when they came to collect her, watching as the child nestled naturally into her mother's arms, her cries softening as if she had finally found where she belonged. Emma had watched too, her hand tight in his, and when the door closed behind them, she whispered, "Now she's safe." Those words carried more power than any speech he had ever given, because they were born of relief and certainty. In the weeks that followed, lawyers finalized the paperwork that had begun quietly in the background of the chaos. Adrian had not been sure, at first, if Emma would want permanence after so many broken promises, but when he asked, her face lit with something he had never seen before. Hope, without hesitation. Today, in a quiet office lined with books and sunlight streaming through tall windows, he signed the final page. The adoption was complete. Emma Vale was no longer a temporary presence in his life, but his daughter in every way that mattered. When they returned home, Josephine had prepared a small celebration. The dining table was set with Emma's favorite food, the cake simple, but adorned with her name written in careful letters. Emma grinned as she looked around the room, her drawings on the walls, Josephine's photos on the mantel, Adrian's steady presence beside her. "It feels different now," she said softly, "like it's really ours." Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder, pride filling him in a way no business victory ever had. The mansion that once held shadows of deceit now carried truth in every corner. It was not wealth or power that made it strong, but the bond of people who had chosen each other and stood against betrayal. For Adrian, the empire he had built meant less than this moment, standing in a home filled with honesty, family, and the quiet certainty that truth had won. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of the mansion, filling the rooms with a glow that felt different from the light of weeks before. Adrian walked slowly through the halls, his hand brushing the frames that now held Emma's colorful drawings and Josephine's old photographs. The house, once a place of performance and careful illusions, had softened. It no longer felt like an empty stage set for deception, but like a home, alive with honesty and presence. The echoes that used to remind him of loneliness were gone, replaced with the sound of Emma humming softly as she colored at the dining table. The shuffle of Josephine preparing tea, the steady rhythm of a family moving in unison. Adrian paused in the doorway and watched Emma, her head bent over a sheet of paper, crayons scattered across the polished wood. Her brown hair fell across her face, and her tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated. He felt something stir in his chest, something warmer than pride, deeper than relief. For years he had measured his worth in the language of stocks, mergers, and power, believing that the size of his empire was proof of his success. But looking at Emma, small and steady, he realized he had been blind. The true fortune he had been searching for was not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but here, in the simple act of being trusted by a child who had every reason not to trust. He crossed the room and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. She looked up, her brown eyes clear, the faintest smile on her lips. "You're working hard," he said softly. She shrugged, her pencil moving again, but he could tell she was pleased by his attention. He pulled a chair beside her, watching her sketch a house with a wide door and people standing close together. It struck him then, this was her vision of family, of safety, of belonging. "Emma," he said, his voice lower now, filled with something he struggled to name. "I need to thank you. You spoke when no one else dared. You saw what I didn't, and you saved more than you know. You saved me, this home, and even the baby. I don't think I'll ever find the right words to tell you how much that means." Her eyes softened, and she leaned against his arm for a moment, a rare gesture of closeness that filled him more than any victory he had ever claimed. The clock ticked in the background, steady and sure, as if marking the beginning of a new life that had nothing to do with wealth or status. Josephine entered with the tea, her expression gentle as she looked at the two of them sitting together. Adrian caught her eye, and for a moment they shared an understanding. Years of service had given her wisdom, but even she seemed to know this transformation was greater than anything he could have achieved alone. Emma set down her crayon, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but this time it carried peace instead of warning. "Now the baby's safe." The words settled in the room like a blessing. Adrian smiled, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was rich in the only way that mattered. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.